Welcome back to Rising Waters. Increasingly, our communities are facing the challenge of managing flood risk from all angles.
But did you know there are steps you can take right in your own home?
That's what today's episode is all about. We'll be exploring practical ways to adapt our outdoor spaces, starting with a concept known as Yardens, where small changes can help prevent flooding and excess runoff.
From there, we'll talk about the challenges of soggy gardens and ways to manage waterlogged soil.
We'll look at how to create a rain garden, which can create beautiful spaces that are designed to capture and absorb rainfall and slow its flow back into the water network.
We'll wrap up with property level resilience measures, which include a range of tools and techniques that directly decrease the risk of flood damage to your home.
Whether you're a homeowner, renter, or simply interested in being a part of a bigger picture, this episode is packed with actionable insights you can do right away. So let's jump in. So let's get into it with our guests. So if you could just introduce yourselves first. So we've got Colin.
So hi, I'm Colin Hall from the flood resilience team for the Environment Agency, and I specialise in working in Northumberland and helping communities become more resilient to the impact of flooding.
Excellent. And John?
My name's John Hayton. I work for Durham Wildlife Trust in education and engagement. And as part of a new project that we're working on, we're starting to look at helping people put rain gardens into their properties.
Brilliant. Sounds like we've got the right people for the episode.
I think we do, yeah. We might do.
Excellent. So what exactly is a Yarden? So I've always talked about Yardens, and I've mentioned it a few times, and I never actually know the actual definition.
Well, I don't know the definition from the Urban Dictionary, but I would say sort of a Yarden it's a more urban, for a more urban environment. People who have a yard, which is predominantly a concrete area with sort of walls, it's a way that you can actually bring wildlife and plants and things like that into that sort of environment. So you can use sort of anything you want, really, sort of old plant pots, welly boots, all these sorts of things, and put sort of plants that'll sort of cope with the weather, take a bit of the rainfall and things like that, so it's not all just stuck in there sort of on that waterproof concrete. Invite wildlife, bees, sort of other pollinators and things into your garden, and just make a nicer space sort of for your own well-being and betterment.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, yeah.
And if everyone did this, what would we see?
We are seeing at the moment increases in surface water flood risk and things like that. So we've got this nasty habit as humans of waterproofing the land. So by getting rid of sort of a lot of our plants and our trees and all these sorts of things. So I think actually sort of people did start to sort of install Yardens and things, we would give a lot more sort of drainage. A lot of that water would sort of have somewhere to go. Would also see nicer sort of environments. We might see sort of happier children, sort of with safer places to play and things like that. People spending more time outdoors, so better mental health and all these sorts of things.
There's a beautiful example in, I can't remember which country it is, but they, you know how the Northeast in particular has all those back lanes. They've got a very similar concept in another country, and they've turned that back lane. They've kind of expanded their Yardens out onto that back lane. They all sit on these benches outside the houses and things like that.
It's just communal.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And it's kind of like those nature corridors, isn't it? It looks very much like that.
It does. And for nature corridors, for you, John, I imagine pollinators love that.
Well, it's really important on that level, but I think, as Colin mentioned as well, just the mental well-being of everyone, to be surrounded by the very hostile brick and concrete surroundings, when you've got that softer surroundings of plant life, and then the animals that call the plant life, those habitats, their home, it starts to have a knock-on effect, and it kind of rolls along and kind of picks up moss as it goes. And what we're interested in is, so it's not just about having some plants there or some greenery, it's what the plants and the greenery attracts and what attracts that. You know, and it's almost like the old lady that swallowed the fly. So this is what I do quite a lot with my schools. So the old lady swallowed a fly. I don't know why she swallowed the fly. An old lady swallowed a spider that wriggled and tiggled and jiggled inside her. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. I don't know why she swallowed the fly. Perhaps she'll die. The old lady swallowed a bird. How absurd. She swallowed a bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider that wriggled and tiggled and jiggled inside. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. I don't know why she swallowed the fly. The old lady swallowed the cat. Fancy that. She swallowed the cat. She swallowed the cat to catch the bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider that wriggled and tiggled and jiggled inside her. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. So actually, the fly needs somewhere to be in the first instance.
I'm also impressed with how much of
I
that
was very
song,
impressed by
you
that.
know.
Yeah, it's
you took
fantastic.
me right back
Yeah,
to the
I was going to
time
say
there,
that.
by the way.
That was like a childhood flashback, but I
no,
definitely had lost
absolutely.
it by the bird, I
But
think.
one of the things that I talk about with the children is, well, yeah, but what happened if there wasn't anywhere for the fly? What would happen to the spider? Oh, right, there's nowhere for the spider, no food for the spider. All right, so if there's no food for the spider and the spider dies, what happens to the bird? Oh, well, I suppose that's going to be the end of the bird. Well, what happens to the cat?
Yeah.
So actually, the food chain that is absolutely reliant on the habitat, it starts on the ground and it starts at that level. It's not all about the big apex predators. It's about that whole network that sits underneath.
So with that, with Yardens and things like that, is that something that people can consider in the planting or anything that they can they look at that picture and go, actually, I'm going to pick these plants instead of these, or I'm going to pick this shrub or whatever it is to kind of help the under ecology, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got different options for a garden, if you like, and some of it, you just plant anything if you want in the first instance, because that's better than nothing.
Yeah.
However, with a little bit of research, and we've all got these funny rectangles now in our pockets that are actually allow us to access all the facts that there are in the world about anything, including kind of cats in hats or whatever. But one of the things that you can just do with a few clicks of a button would be what would be a good plant to have in my garden. So it might be that you're thinking of pollinators, like Colin mentioned there, or it might be that you want to think about something a bit more helpful. You might want to think, well, I want to plant some herbs. So, okay, so what could I plant in my garden? Well, you know, any number of herbs that you can plant there. Or I've got a bit more space. I might want to plant something to eat. I might want to look at vegetables. So the options are kind of numerous there for you if you just kind of have a little bit of a think about it. But you know, mint and chervil, they're really easy to grow in terms of herbs, or you can start thinking about things like alpine strawberries. You can be thinking about peas. There's lots of very simple options that you can grow just in a window box.
I think that's a good point that you mentioned there with easy to grow, because I think a lot of people actually think of a garden and think about it as hard work. And it doesn't have to be. And don't get obsessed with this whole thing. It has to be tidy and it has to be organised. Wildlife isn't like that. It can be beautiful and things if you just let it sort of have a go itself. So it doesn't have to be overwhelming and sort of backbreaking an extra task. It can be a nice to do, and you can sort of leave it and let it start doing its own thing a bit.
That's exactly my problem, because I do have a very small garden, and I think I talked about this previously. It actually worked in the end. So I ended up being able to plant some strawberries and plant some lemon balm and also some chili plants. Chili plants were like 50p. They were all like dying in the shop. And I was like, I'm just going to save them and see if I can grow them. And I did, and I ended up having it. But the thing that was weird for me was that I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that I'd grown it, and whether it sounds silly, but whether it was safe to eat. And
I know what you mean.
it was a very strange concept, because almost if you come buying it from the supermarket, you kind of know it's safe and you're like, yeah, whatever, straight in. When you've grown it, you have no pest control. You have nothing. You don't know necessarily what's happening around it unless you've got some tight, you know. So I was a bit like, but I went for it anyway. It was amazing.
Nothing tastes better than food that you've grown yourself.
They tasted so good, and I was really surprised. And once I got over that fear, I like, next year I'm going to be looking at what else I can do. And I think you just got to do those small bits and take a chance first.
And with those sorts of things as well, sort of what you're going to get from that is, say you're looking at that and you had those reservations, then if you get children, sort of your children, nieces, nephews, anything like that in the garden as well, you're then going to pass that on. So then they're not going to have that same issue when they're older, that same reservation, because it hasn't come in a plastic wrap.
That's it. And it is a very real thing, because like, so my husband, his family grew up and they were really big gardeners, and so they just eat everything from the garden. And I remember when I first went there and they were like, oh yeah, we've got these plums, and I was like, oh, are they okay though, really? But then you just don't think about it. If you grow up around it, it just doesn't matter. And it is so much better. It all tastes way better, and you haven't got those pesticides and everything else, all the chemicals that they put on your fruit and veg that you get from the supermarkets too.
You don't have to be an expert going into it. You can go into something and just say, oh, I'm just going to have a go and see if I can rescue this, you know, and actually you can find yourself thinking, I did that.
Yes. Yeah. I got that real sense of
accomplishment.
You know, and then I'm going to try something else. And it's absolutely fine to get things wrong.
Yeah.
And you know, there's little risk with it because it's gonna go anyway. Yeah. But I think one of the things that I noticed as well in my yard, there was this spot where I deliberately did this, not to measure and be too nerdy about it, but I was just like, I wonder if it will help. Basically, there's a spot in my yard where the water gathers, and it happens to be because the concrete's all wonky and stuff. And I put this planter right close to it, and it's not there anymore during when it rains. So even in that moment, I only recently noticed when it had quite a big downpour, and I was like, oh, that spot's gone. And it made me think about all the advice that I tell everyone else and everything. And I thought, oh, look at me doing that thing.
It actually works.
So it does work, and it does help. And that small little puddle is now no longer there, which means it's no longer going into the system. And if everyone else had the same thing, we would have much less water going in.
Yeah. 100%.
So, and you think about the multiple benefits of these things. We talk about it a lot. So
yeah, well, that's it. It's beneficial for you. You don't have these puddles in your garden now. And for some people, it's not just a puddle. It can end up, coming in the house and it's, much bigger than that. And you're not overwhelming the drainage system. So as you say, if everyone did that, then you'd be in so much of a better position. We wouldn't be seeing as much surface water flooding, which would be incredible. And you've probably made a really nice space at the same time.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So is there any particular plants, John, that would help with water absorption, with soils, keeping the soils healthy, keeping them pocketed and things like that?
Again, I mean, anything that you put in there is going to absorb some water. Yeah. However, some plants kind of are more thirsty, if you like, than others. And also some plants thrive in kind of more moist, damp areas. So if you think about, for example, bluebells, you get the bluebells in a nice shaded woody area because that's where they're like, where your daffodils, they like to be out in the open. So again, depending on whether or not you're thinking about pollinating plants or herbs or vegetables or even trees, there are certain things. So for example, rhubarb likes it quite damp. So that's kind of, and it's not too difficult to grow either. Yeah. So peas, they might need something to climb on. Tomatoes, which is why you often find the tomatoes in a greenhouse, because they want the moisture that stays in that area.
My friends are always proud when they've got the tomato. They show me the first, look at this tomato I've grown.
Exactly. But I mean, if you wanted to go down the flowering route, a lot of lilies tend to like quite damp soil. Iris, they like damp soil as well. There's a daisy-like flower called aster, which is really, really pretty.
Oh yeah, it's gorgeous flower.
That's really nice. And again, they're all pollinators, so they're actually really, really important on a kind of a wider network beyond your yard and what you want from that, because actually they're a network that's really important right the way across the natural spectrum. And if you've got more room, it might be that you wanted to look at something like a red maple or willow. Willow loves, I mean, you can always get your willow trees down by the riverside. So if you've got a little bit more space, it might be that you could look at that, or alder. Alder likes damp areas as well.
So sort of looking at the wider spaces and sort of moved away from Yardens and more into sort of like gardening and with people who do have that green space. I know I find that quite a few of my community and people I've spoken to, even in the role that I do, they're wondering how they can do more. And also, because we tend to go to flood risk areas, it tends to be that they have a soggy garden. And some people know how to embrace this, other people don't. What is a soggy garden? Because when it's mentioned to me, I've just imagined like pretty much a waterlogged garden, which is probably what it is. But
essentially, yeah, but with soggy gardens, it's a question of thinking about, what do you want to do with this? Do you want to engage with it on that level and embrace it as a wetland or semi-wetland area? Or do you want to do some work to see if you can help to manage it to be kind of a way and it might be something like just turning the soil over to aerate the soil. It might be something to do with putting some kind of coarse gravel in and underneath, which it can help with drainage. Or it might be to do with actually doing some homework and checking what the water table is round about in that area, and kind of what's happening in the kind of the local habitats next door to that. And actually, is it something as simple as checking your own drainage? So is it something as simple as just making sure that you've got access to those drainage systems, which would kind of help to lessen the amount of moisture that's in the soil there?
Yeah, and just making sure those drainage sort of avenues are looked after, I suppose, and makes sense for the environment around us, and we're not just running it straight into the drain, but also just kind of holding it back, but in a way that isn't waterlogging your garden is probably the most strategic it gets in gardening.
One of the other things, so is a lot of times we're seeing sort of with new builds and things, is the sort of the soil sort of content and things, and the soil sort of quality that they've got, because a lot of it is building waste and things like that that's been then sort of turfed over. So you've got a lot of people who are buying the first houses or buying these new builds, and they've got a soggy garden, but purely because of sort of everything that's actually sort of underneath, like clay, that sort of clay and things like that. So you can have a look at things like that. I personally had I don't have a new build, but I did have an area in my garden that was always soggy. And I mean, not everybody has to do this, but I bought a big auger bit from a hammer drill, and I drilled down into those sections there, and I replaced those the soil that I took up with compost. And I don't have that problem now with the garden. So it's little things like that, just sort of do a little bit of sort of, as John was saying, just do a little bit of digging in your garden, sort of find out what's actually under there, because you might have rubble, you might have sort of all these sort of dolomites and things like that underneath your sort of your topsoil and your turf that you're not aware of. That is actually, and from a flooding perspective, if it's not able to drain there, it's going to go somewhere else. So you might be improving your chances of sort of not being flooded by improving that, and you're also going to have a nice usable garden.
Depends if you want to embrace it, doesn't it? And it depends if you have the time and the energy, I guess, to be able to, because a soggy garden as a concept is a great idea in a sense that it holds up water, but if it's going to impact your property, it's a different thing. So it's interesting to try and find the balance.
So I guess it's a bit more about personal preference. So whether you have the time to kind of or want to create it into a wetland, a habitat, or whether you just want a kind of a bit more of a quick fix where you're not having to worry about the water gathering. But for the people that do want to do something a bit more and turn it into a wetland, what would you kind of recommend their starting point could be?
Yeah, so you can embrace it and you can take it to the nth degree, and you could actually say, do you know what, I'm actually going to dig a little bit more out here, and actually I'm going to put a liner in, and I'm going to go the whole hog and actually go for the whole pond thing. But if that area is naturally inclined to being damp, that's going to be really, really helpful if you do have an interest in whether or not you might start getting things like amphibians coming in there, frogs. If it stays damp throughout the year, that could be a perfect site for spawn in the early spring there. And especially if you've got little ones, the idea of the little ones kind of finding a frog or a toadlet or a newt or something.
It's very exciting.
I mean, any day with a newt in it's kind of a good day, really, isn't it? And and again, it's just opening yourself out to a slightly different experience, and it making kind of your garden a little bit different to somebody else's that might be absolutely pristine, kind of with their lawn in nice stripes, and actually something that's been wilded to some degree. Well, that's where you're going to be kind of getting your hedgehogs and stuff at dusk, and if it is a bit damp, then that's got all the food that hedgehogs would be interested in. And as we've lost well over 70% of our hedgehogs in the last 50 years, it's a bit of a treat to be able to have something like that. That's where your garden becomes something a bit more magical, a bit more of a habitat, and a diverse habitat as well, because it might just be that you've got an area of your garden or your yard or whatever that's damp. There might be other parts of it that aren't. So actually, even within this kind of small space of a few square meters, you can have this diversity, which again is another plus, really.
It is, and people are setting up cams to look at the wildlife that they're bringing to their yards. My friend's got a hedgehog cam. And it's gorgeous. Like he puts them on his stories on social media, and I just think this is really cute. And they have them sleeping in little bundles and things like that, because he's got a little box that he's made out of it. It's fantastic. And I just think that kind of stuff you can really get into and change. Absolutely,
it becomes an interest. It becomes I had a trail cam in my yard because of this network we were getting foxes coming in, and me and my children were like, "Whoa, that's really, really cool." I remember one night I was working late, and I just looked over at the window, and the fox was looking in at me through the window. And foxes aren't everyone's bag, but I get dead excited.
I do
and
too.
I love the fact that actually where I live, there is a network underneath there that can support an animal like that. That suggests that it's a very healthy network. And again, the diversity is all a part of having a much wider and more effective network.
And you don't need a country house to do it either.
No,
quite often, like, we go out. There's been a few occasions where I've popped out to, places to stay, and they've got these gorgeous, and we can back in onto the hills, and you get wildlife coming in, and actually you can do that in places that are much tighter.
Fairly built up, but you just have enough of that kind of nature there. Yeah.
I live in the middle of North Shields, and that's it.
There you go.
So going back to flooding, because this is the thing about flooding in general, is it because there's so many multiple benefits. It tends to be that we fall into the trap of talking about all the other benefits over flooding, which is probably infinitely more interesting. But
not to us.
Not to us. We love it. But there is a concept of the rain garden, and now we have a step-by-step online. But I'd love to go through, John, with you very briefly, just what rain garden is and why it works the way it does, and sort of the layers probably.
I think I'll just take a step back from that, and this is much more Colin's area than mine, but rain gardens are becoming a thing of necessity for us now, which is kind of linked to more intense weather events, which includes kind of more intense rainfall. And what the whole idea behind a rain garden is this idea to be able to channel the excess rainfall that comes down, skittering down off the roofs into the gutters, down the drain pipe. And what it is it interrupts that flow of water from the downpipe to going into the sewage systems in our grounds. Because what happens is in intense rainfall, the sewage systems unfortunately can struggle to be able to accommodate all that excess water, and that's when it backs up. So the whole idea of a rain garden is it's essentially just a holding tank, which allows some of that excess rainwater to hold just for in some cases just for a short while, and it filters through. So it might be something as simple as just a plastic box. Okay, and big storage box from various different stores, and there's many different stores that are available from where you can get a big plastic storage box. However, what the rain garden is it has a piece of piping that runs at the bottom of the box and has holes drilled in the top so that water can get into the pipe once it reaches a certain height within the box. And around that we would put some aggregate, whether or not it's something like leca, which is kind of a clay granules, or limestone. On top of that we would have a separation layer. Hessian works really well for that. And on top of that we've got some topsoil and some compost, peat free obviously. And the whole idea is that the rain kind of comes down from the drain pipe, from that downpipe. It's filtered into the top layer. It filters down naturally through that top layer. It filters down through the Hessian. It filters through the leca or the limestone, and then into the pipe. So it's been interrupted. That storm flow's been interrupted, but it's also filtering as it goes. And then that can either be diverted back into the drainage system, and that's fine. All it's done is it's interrupted and it's slowed down that flow. Or if you want, you can even divert it to a feature of the garden, either to a soggy area at the bottom of your garden or to a pond that you might be trying to establish. So there's different options there. So you can actually use it as a tool to divert for habitat purposes, or just quite straightforward back into the system. The point is it's slowing that storm surge.
I saw there was on the Chelsea Flower Show recently. They had the flood resilient garden, and they had those chains. Now I was really curious about those because I hadn't really come across that concept at the time. The chains guide the water through the water tension, which is obviously very clever, to the places they want it to go. And it could be to another box. It could be to, that you can do all sorts with it. And I thought that was just really clever to just put this chain along the guttering and have it just, go somewhere else and guide it. And it looked beautiful. considering it was an industrial piece of metal, So it's really nice.
Yeah, that idea of reappropriating something, I think, for the greater good's really, really nice. But also, again, it's interrupting that storm surge, which I think is, key from Colin's area.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the big problems that we are seeing is with the drainage that we have. I mean, a lot of it now across the UK in general is Victorian, if not pre-Victorian. So it's just absolutely not designed for the amount of rainfall that we get now, which is, getting worse by the year. So Colin, for where rain gardens are fantastic, but perhaps in some cases not enough, what are some of the other things that people could do in terms of property level resilience?
Do you mean to keep water out of the actual home itself?
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I've seen far too much of this fairly recently. So yeah, you're right on what you're saying. Sort of, we are seeing the climate is changing. We're seeing heavier downpours over shorter periods. So we're seeing a lot more surface water events. So it no longer is flooding just the sort of the ownership of the river sort of bursting its banks and things like that. You've got places that have nowhere near watercourses that are now being impacted. Or actually are near watercourses, but people aren't aware the watercourse is there anymore because it's been culverted and paved over the top.
Yeah.
Such as a town I've just been
cases.
in there. What people can do, I completely agree with what John's saying there about sort of the initial thing is to start sort of trying to slow that down, sort of take so that rainfall there has got somewhere else to go.
Which can make a huge difference.
100%. Please don't sort of be installing artificial turf and things like that because it's all just adding to that extra waterproofing. But sort of in regards to actually sort of protecting your home, there's all sorts of things you can do. You can have install flood doors. You can install sort of flood barriers. So a flood door would be an actual door sort of that would replace your door and sort of would be watertight, and you wouldn't have to sort of install it or anything during a flood event. It would just sort of operate in that way, but they can be expensive. You could then get a barrier if you want to go down that route, but then you would need to have that earlier forewarning of a potential sort of flood to install that sort of that barrier. There's other things as well, so don't just look at the flood doors, look at every aspect, because if water will find every way that it possibly can into your home. So think about your air bricks. So getting air brick covers, your non-return valves as well. So your washing machine and things like that, and all your pipes for your toilets and things like that, they're going out. So if it can go out, it can come back in. So actually sort of think about having a non-return valve on there, so then it can't sort of access your home in that way. Think about as well things like, I've noticed on a lot of new builds as well, the damp proof cost seems to be very low on a lot of these houses. So you can actually get a clear coat sort of waterproof layer that you could actually paint onto your sort of house to a certain height, and that will protect your brickwork and it'll protect that that damp from sort of actually coming into your property. Don't paint over your air bricks because it still needs to be able to breathe, but it's all these sorts of things. Little your weep holes as well that people don't think about as well.
Check they're real. There was a wonderful person online who goes around and just he knows that sometimes that they're not installed properly, and he just has a look and sort of exposes where they're not real. And if you just tap them, they come out. They don't
but
work.
Little things like that, water's going to go in there. So all these sorts of things. So there's lots and lots of different ways and means that you can do it. There's some brilliant sites as well. The Blue Pages, National Flood Forum, sort of have a look on there. There's lots of companies that would install these measures. What I would say is if you can get somebody to actually do an assessment of your home first of all, because everybody's home's different, and have a look at that. But even sort of actually inside your home as well, things like big plugs for your toilet. And things as well, so you don't want, you were mentioning sewage earlier, you definitely don't want it coming sort of out to your toilet and things like that. So all these sorts of things. But what I would say as well to incorporate it all is have yourself a personal flood plan as well to incorporate. So you've got all that personal sort of, those personal measures there, sort of the flood doors, your barriers and things like that. But you need to have a plan in order to put that in place, because what I've seen more and more is people aren't getting a lot of time to actually sort of enact and these plans and put things in place. So if you can be a bit more on the ball and sort of take away that sort of panic time of where is everything, where are our flood bores stored, are they sort of stored correctly and things like that.
And it is about considering your house, because like you say, and your flood risk, because you could be at risk of surface water, in which case most people would think, oh, well, that means I'll just put a flood barrier on the door and then it won't come in from the street.
Unfortunately, everywhere's
but that's
at risk
where,
of surface water.
John, you talked about this earlier, is that actually it comes up through the sewers. Like you say, if your area's surface water risk, then you need to consider a little bit more, because obviously you can see the river, and we have an advantage in a sense that we can understand what the river's gonna, when it comes out, it's probably gonna come in this direction. But equally, they've got their own risks as well with the same thing, that it could depending on how their drainage is sort of working and things like that. So you really need to consider your individual situation.
I always say this, it's about mindset change. So unfortunately the flood risk is increasing. We as humans, we sort of protect our properties from fire. So we have fire alarms, we have flame retardant sort of materials and things in our homes now. We protect our homes from burglaries and theft and things like that. We have locks and we have burglar alarms and things like that. But we don't look at sort of flood risk in the same way. We still think a big organisation is going to put a big engineered flood scheme in and that's going to save everything. It's changing now. We have to start looking at our own individual properties and start putting measures in in order to do so.
Yeah. And I guess, as you say, having things like those personal flood plans, first of all, it costs nothing to do that. You can grab one off a .gov website and fill it in. And
you can make it how you want it to be as well. You don't have to follow their guidance, but maybe just use it as a structure.
But it also just means that for the people where, as you say, pretty much everyone is at risk of surface water flooding now on some level. So for people who haven't experienced flooding before, so haven't really had to think about it, it means that you've gone through it. So if it does happen, hopefully it won't, but if it does, you have actually thought about it and kind of know what to do or who to contact. And that kind of thing. It's not going to cost you much. It's not, like putting in a floodgate or something like that, which can be quite expensive, but it could really be beneficial should you end up in the situation where you're going to flood.
Yeah, you wouldn't even have to go out and buy flood doors and such like that. You could get an inflatable flood sack that you could actually sort of have stored in your house. And as I said, you don't have to be like sort of Schwarzenegger to actually sort of move these basically with a sandbag. You have to have
They're
them
a lot
pre-filled.
heavier than they look.
They don't. They have a certain lifespan basically with a sandbag. When it's pre-filled, it's about 10 to 12 months. You have to have somewhere in order to store them. Whereas these, so you can have them stored sort of anywhere. It could actually sort of prevent your property from flooding. And it's fairly cheap to do so.
Yeah.
But as I was saying, it's like it's around mindset change and things. So it's not about just individually protecting your property. Look at sort of the drains in your streets and things like that. If you see them blocked, report them. If there's leaf fall sort of on your drains and things like that, what's to stop you sort of going and just sweeping it up and then sort of popping it in your brown bin or whatever colour bin basically gets rid of your sort of garden waste and things like that. Yeah. And it's all going to protect your property, your neighbours' properties and things like that. Yeah. So it's all about that sort of contingency planning. I know I'm sort of talking a lot here, but
you're fine.
It's I'm quite passionate about it and having sort of I was in a house that had been flooded this morning, unfortunately. So when you're thinking about these sorts of things, when you've got a plan, what happens if you've got a flood barrier or a flood door, but you're on holiday?
Yeah.
So actually sort of maybe incorporate your plan with a neighbour. Yeah. So then sort of they can install your flood barrier if you're away on holiday or something like that. Or if you've got a neighbour who's elderly, they're going to have the same risk. Can you put their flood barrier in, things like that? So don't just maybe even think about it from a personal point of thing. So talk about it sort of from a streetwise, sort of have a little bit of a community.
Because it tends to be that most people come together after the fact, isn't it? And that's one of the biggest issues, is that every community has competing priorities, has things that they're more concerned with, especially if it hasn't happened yet.
Yes.
Yeah. And so just having that conversation to just once, for everyone to understand what the situation is. Even if you just go online, there's a risk, cool, let's have a quick chat about it. If my local parish or, the club that I go to regularly, that's the street club.
The pub, something. Quiz.
You don't want to be shutting the gate after the horses board.
Trying to get together and sort it out. I know there was a wonderful, one of our flood warden groups, they had a street event, I think, and they all got together and they actually just had food out all together, but they just happened to talk about flood risk at the same time, and it just sounds quite counterintuitive, but at the same time that's how relationships are built. I know that my friend Ed, who has come onto the podcast to talk about things, often mentions that relationships are what actually save communities. And it's not the necessary, always the physical things that are in place, but the relationships that are built to put those things in place.
Absolutely.
After a plan.
And I think that's something that we've seen through building flood groups and watching them as they, without kind of necessarily bringing in any of these property level resilience measures, but actually just working together as a community, communicating that risk to the wider community so people are actually aware at the start as well, has actually made a massive difference to how resilient the community has been when a flood has hit.
I think as well, something that's running parallel to that is the communication would mirror behavioural change. And we should all now be aware that there's certain behaviours that we could avoid, like putting wipes down the toilet, putting fat down the sink and all that kind of stuff, because they are all contributing factors to issues in the sewers, which can back up the water. If we weren't doing that in the first instance, then maybe the leaf fall in autumn wouldn't be quite so impactful. But we can't take away from the fact that leaf fall in autumn is a major issue for our drains and for our sewers, and that's compounded when we've already got fatbergs with lots of non-biodegradable materials in there that don't go away naturally. And again, it's just that communication and that community spirit that you're talking about there can just kind of maybe bring it to the forefront of people's
It can also be
perception.
Policing your own community to a point, because one of the big things we're seeing now, blocking drains, are disposable vapes. So in urban areas, so it's a huge thing. So sort of people don't realise, but this sort of we saw a lot of flooding recently, sort of in an area, and it was outside of vape shops, because they were coming and they were putting the disposable vapes, and then the local authority were coming and clearing out sort of the drains, and just all this whack load of disposable vapes.
I've seen the exact same thing recently in some of my communities, and when you did look, it was filled with vapes.
So when you talk about that mindset change, it's all these sorts of things. Building companies almost sort of not putting down building waste down into drains and things, and understanding, because it's all, we need it to work. We don't need it sort of 90% of the time, but we need it to work sort of that 10% of the time when we get that heavy rainfall. And we can't then start complaining and moaning to people if we're not all sort of doing our own bit.
What's interesting as well is that you're finding this in places that we've just never had before. And that's the scariest thing, is that you can only plan so much. You can only have so many maps. You can only have so much kind of low-lying area topography, LiDAR, that sort of thing. If the urban topography has been changed by someone or something drainage-wise has been blocked, that all goes out the window, and we find places that get flooded that have never flooded before, simply because that's changed.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I was recently in an area that flooded where and a nursery had to be evacuated, and you had 2-3-year-old children having to be sort of carried through sort of surface sewage and sort of surface water, while it's absolutely bucketing and rain on them as well. And a lot of it's coming down to sort of building waste that have been poured down the drain and blocked the drain, and sort of that nursery now is gutted, and the sort of it's going to cost sort of tens of thousands of pounds to sort of fix, but it's also the impact it's had on those children.
Absolutely.
And these things are avoidable if we just stop and think about sort of what the future and sort of what our actions are actually saying.
Yeah, most definitely. So that's why we'd love to be in a space where you can just answer this with rain gardens, flowers and things like that, but actually it's our practice as well.
Yeah, it's just those daily activities. When you're throwing something away, think, actually, what is this going to do, whether you're at home or whether you're at work? So it can be as simple as those little things, really.
It's an impact on the wildlife as well, though, isn't it? So not just, sorry, I'm boring, I talk about flooding all the time, but it is the impact on wildlife and things as well.
No, absolutely, yeah.
We do litter picks in my local area. We've got an ancient woodland right behind where I live, and we do litter picks there, and it's gorgeous. You can hear the owls on a night, and you can see sort of all this beautiful wildlife, but we still have to go and do litter picks because there's people there who sort of don't respect it the same way sort of other people do.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been involved with various aspects and various projects through the Wildlife Trust, and we do the same thing. And one of the things that's maybe worth bearing in mind is that with these kind of intense weather events, litter always ends up in a water source, because that's where it sticks. It can blow around wherever, but eventually it sticks in the water source, goes out into the rivers, and it ends up on our coasts. whether or not it ends up going right out to the middle of the Caribbean, or whether or not it's just stuck on Whitburn Beach because it's there in the rocks and in the rock pools. And like you say, the impact on the wildlife, of kind of, especially the non-biodegradable, our plastics and stuff, unfortunately you do find puffins and guillemots kind of with bits of plastics entangled around them. We do find cetaceans like large dolphins and whales with kilograms of carrier bags in their stomach because they mistook it for a jellyfish when they were hunting. And those are very, very real consequences. As long as we kind of all do our bit, and if we can be communal about it, so that it's we, not just I, then we can hopefully start impacting change.
Sorry, Steph.
No, just agreeing. That's okay.
There's a beautiful project. I think that the Durham Wildlife Trust was involved in, was in Hayton. I think it was back on the map or something like that. And they have an incredible system where they have a food bank, which they get most of their materials and food and things like that from a local allotment. And the local allotment, obviously, you're then not going to the supermarket, increasing your carbon footprint, etc. You're actually coming to the food bank, and they actually teach you at the food bank how to cook the food. And it's just mad, like what you can actually do when you look at something carefully and take something like Hendon, especially because it's one of those areas that's had the toughest time in terms of like amenities around it and things like that. And it also has a bit of coastal flooding there, but it also has majorly surface water issues. But it's got this allotment there that was going to be turned into something else. And I think that was saved and brought back to the community. And
it's been developed and it's been grown and it's nurtured.
Yeah.
And it's not just a natural nurturing, it becomes a communal nurturing.
Yes, yeah.
And that then becomes feel good as well.
It's pride, isn't it? You get the pride in your community. You've got something to sort of that stands out and something good that comes from it. And I know Hendon quite well, and Hendon sort of, the East End was all part of sort of the shipbuilding and things in the areas of Sunderland, and they're a very proud area. And sort of, I'm sure my age here, we used to drink the East End sort of at times and things, and it was great. And it seems to have sort of dropped a little bit, but sort of these sorts of things pick it back up, and you get that pride in your community again, and people want to come into the area because of that. The community spirit there, when I went in, I was just so taken. It was one of my favorite places purely because of how wholesome it is. I remember going in just thinking, like, this community's got one of the hardest things to deal with in terms of deprivation and things like that. But they have some of the most connected and so kind, like, of people, because they've had to deal with all of these things. They've had to deal with flooding, they've had to deal with sort of social issues and things like that. And people like the Durham Wildlife Trust and the Back on the Map have all come in and created this incredible space. And I think there was a nature corridor made down the high street. I think everyone got together and did like some little bee hotel, like little bug hotels or things like that, and hung them all along the high street as well.
Little motorway for the pollinators to be able to stop.
Because I think there was the high street separates two parks, maybe, or something. There was like something that had been separated.
Effectively Backhouse Park around that way.
And they'd made this corridor to connect these two spaces again, and it'd just be really interesting to see.
Does the school get involved? Because I know the secondary schools is a really good school, and I'm just wondering if they're involved as well. I can imagine they are.
Yeah, I imagine they would be. I didn't see them at the time. I just saw volunteers who were just so passionate. But I think there is a lot of work just going on, and if we could model that everywhere else, that would be amazing.
Yeah, but we don't have to do it. It's sort of it can be led by anybody.
Absolutely.
So anybody can sort of just think, I want to just invoke a bit of change and push a little bit of change, and sort of maybe there's lots of places where you can go for guidance.
And it just takes one person to start that off, doesn't it? You don't need an organisation or anyone to come in. You can do that yourself.
Well, this is one of the things that the Trust is trying to do, is to empower self-action and communal self-action. And if it just takes a little bit of a kickstart, then we can provide whatever support is available. But then we don't feel the need to have to hold on to it and hold it. It's yours. Take it and run with it.
Casting the net further.
Absolutely.
We'll give you the resources. It's good. Excellent. Well, I think that might be close to the end of our time now, but it's been really, really great to speak to you. Got a bit heavy there, but I love that we finished on a nice positive note there.
Yeah.
I think it's probably worth just, there are problems. Some of them are climate-based and some of them are behavioural. But actually, hopefully, this discussion kind of has highlighted some of the kind of solutions and resolutions to that.
Yeah, it's not hopeless.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Not in the slightest.
Yeah.
Lots of good people out there doing a lot of good things.
If we identify what's wrong, let's identify what the solutions are.
Yeah.
That's been good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Cool.
Thank you for watching this episode of Rising Waters. Next, we are going to tell you what to do if flooding is happening now. First, make sure your gas, electricity and water supply is turned off, only if it is safe to do so. Do not touch an electrical supply if you are standing in flood water. If you are unsure on how to do this, call your provider. Second, get to safety. Ensure you move family, pets, vehicles and other important items to safety. This could be upstairs to a higher ground or onto higher shelves if you are living in a bungalow. Third, if you have flood protection, for example flood barriers, sandbags or air brick covers, use them now. Fourth, stay informed. For information and updates, listen to the radio or television or keep up to date on a smart device. Fifth, avoid floodwaters where possible. Don't walk or drive through floodwater. Did you know it takes just 15 centimetres of floodwater to knock a grown adult off their feet and as little as 30 centimetres of floodwater to float a car? Lastly, always follow advice from your local council or the emergency services as they may ask you to evacuate. Thanks again for tuning in to Rising Waters. Remember, stay dry, stay alert and stay safe. This episode of Rising Waters was made possible by all of our partners and volunteers. Make sure to check out the show notes or description for this episode to learn more about what you heard today.